If you grew up in the 1970s watching one of your parents pack their things into a station wagon, there's a reason you process relationships differently than anyone else. Psychologists have identified 5 rare psychological traits that only exist in people who experienced divorce during this specific decade. Traits that can never be replicated. Because the 1970s were the first generation where divorce became normalized. Between 1970 and 1979, the divorce rate doubled, creating what researchers call the Great Family Restructuring. 1 million children per year watched their families split apart, with almost no therapeutic support, no co-parenting apps, and no language to explain what was happening. What this did to your brain wasn't just about losing a parent. It created neural pathways around independence, emotional regulation, and trust that neuroscientists are only now beginning to understand. The 1970s were a paradox wrapped in shag carpeting, women's liberation and no-fault divorce laws. Sesame Street teaching tolerance and families fragmenting at record speed. It was the decade of both collective hope and private devastation. Divorce went from taboo to trendy faster than any generation could adjust. In 1970, your parents splitting up made you the weird kid. By 1979, you were just one of many. But here's the thing, there was no roadmap, no family therapist specializing in conscious uncoupling, no books explaining why daddy lived in an apartment now, just kids trying to make sense of seismic shifts with zero guidance. If you experienced this explains why you developed what psychologists call hyper-self-reliance and an almost supernatural ability to read emotional rooms. If you didn't, this will help you understand those who didn't, why they might seem emotionally guarded even when they desperately want connection. The emotional interpreter. Reading between adult Lisi in the 1970s, parents didn't communicate about the divorce process. They whispered behind closed doors, had tense phone calls that ended when you walked in, told you everything's fine while crying in the bathroom. Unlike today, where family therapists facilitate age-appropriate conversations, kids back then became amateur psychologists by necessity. You learned to decode your mother's forced smile, to gauge your father's mood by how heavily he set down his briefcase. You memorized which topics caused fights and navigated around them like landmines. This wasn't just survival, it was advanced emotional cartography. When a 9-year-old spends months deciphering unspoken tension, their anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's emotional processing center, develops accelerated pattern recognition. You were essentially doing cognitive work that normally develops in late adolescence. Your brain built superhighways for reading vocal tone shifts, and environmental mood changes. Fast forward to today, and those who grew up during this time are the colleagues who just know when something's wrong in a meeting, the partners who can sense your bad day before you say a word, the friends who pick up on group tension nobody else notices. It's not magic, it's neurology sculpted by necessity. But here's what most people miss. This skill comes with a cost. You're so attuned to others' emotional states that you sometimes can't identify your own. You became the thermometer, not the temperature. The Sunday transition protocol. Becoming 2 different children every other weekend. You packed a small suitcase, traveled between homes that had different rules, different food, maybe different last names on the mailbox. Your mother's house had structure and vegetables. Your father's had lax bedtimes and cap and crunch for dinner. Unlike today's divorced families with shared calendars and consistent parenting philosophies, 1970s divorce was the Wild West. You didn't transition between homes. You code-switched between identities. This wasn't just about remembering which parent allowed what. It was identity fragmentation. When a child regularly shifts between 2 different family systems with contradictory expectations, their sense of self becomes what psychologists call contextually adaptive. Your brain learned that identity isn't fixed, it's performative. You became whoever that environment needed you to be. The cognitive load was enormous. You tracked 2 sets of rules, 2 emotional landscapes, 2 versions of family history. You learned early that truth itself was relative. What was acceptable to discuss at mom's was forbidden at dad's. This created what researchers now recognize as situational authenticity, the ability to be genuinely yourself in multiple, contradictory ways. Fast forward to today, and these individuals are chameleons in the best and most exhausting sense. They excel in diverse environments, navigate corporate culture and creative spaces with equal ease, can code switch across social classes, age groups, and professional contexts seamlessly. They're the ultimate adapters. But here's the shadow side. Sometimes they don't know which version is really them. They've spent so long being situationally appropriate that authentic desire can feel unreachable. They're still that kid packing a suitcase, trying to figure out which self to bring. The parentified child. When kids become caregivers in the 1970s, newly single mothers often worked full-time for the first time. Fathers in their bachelor apartments didn't know how to cook or do laundry, and the child became something else entirely. You became the confidant, the translator between warring parents, the one who made sure your younger siblings got to school, the emotional support animal for your devastated mother. Unlike today, where therapists warn against parentification, 1970s divorce culture had no such awareness. Your mother told you about the affair. Your father explained his loneliness. You held secrets that children shouldn't hold, made decisions about adult problems, managed emotional needs that exceeded your developmental capacity. This created what's called premature ego development. Your prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and decision-making, was forced online years before it was ready. You developed adult-level responsibility without adult-level emotional regulation. It's like running sophisticated software on hardware that hasn't finished installing. Fast forward to today, and those who experience this are often the most competent people in any room. They're the ones everyone relies on during a crisis. The project managers who see 5 steps ahead. The friends who organize the group vacation. They're responsible, capable, and seemingly tireless. But here's what they hide. They're exhausted. They've been managing other people's emotions since they were 7. They don't know how to not be needed. And when someone tries to take care of them, they literally don't know how to receive it. They're still that 10-year-old making dinner because mom came home crying. The loyalty trap. Loving both parents in a war zone in the 1970s, divorce was often hostile. No mediators, no co-parenting apps, no cultural emphasis on staying friends for the kids. Your parents talked badly about each other, used you as a messenger, asked you to choose sides in a war you didn't understand. Unlike today's more civilized separations, or at least the cultural expectation of them 1970s, divorce was often open warfare with children as collateral damage. You loved both parents, but loving both meant betraying each one. If you enjoyed time with dad, mom felt abandoned. If you defended mom, dad accused you of being brainwashed. Your loyalty became a zero-sum game where someone always lost. This created what psychologists call cognitive dissonance at developmental critical periods, holding 2 contradictory truths simultaneously while your brain is still forming. The psychological term is divided loyalty syndrome, but that doesn't capture the cellular level stress. Your nervous system existed in constant low-level activation. You learned that love itself was dangerous, that expressing affection for one person could wound another, that safety meant emotional neutrality. Fast forward to today, and these individuals often struggle with what looks like commitment issues but is actually loyalty terror. They're the ones who panic when partners want to meet their family, who keep friend groups separate, who struggle to fully invest in any one relationship because some part of them is still afraid that loving one person means betraying another. But here's the redemption. They're also fiercely loyal once they commit. They understand that love isn't finite, that choosing one person doesn't negate another. They just needed decades to believe it was safe. Growing up with divorced parents in the 1970s didn't just shape your childhood. It fundamentally rewired your brain's approach to relationships, responsibility, and reality itself. You developed emotional intelligence decades ahead of schedule, learned adaptation as a survival skill, became fluent in complexity before you could drive a car. These weren't just experiences, they were formative neurological events during critical developmental windows. The research is clear. Children of 1970s divorce developed unique psychological profiles that distinguished them from both earlier and later divorce cohorts. You were the experimental generation, the first wave, the ones who had to figure it out without books, therapists, or cultural scripts. If you experienced this, understand that your hypercompetence, your emotional radar, your adaptabilities aren't personality quirks. They're trauma responses that became superpowers. Your challenges with vulnerability and trust aren't failures, they're the logical result of navigating an impossible situation with zero support. If you didn't experience this, now you understand why your partner might struggle to fully relax, why your colleague takes on too much, Why your friend seems to read your mind but can't ask for what they need. They're not broken. They're brilliant, sculpted by necessity into people who can handle anything except, sometimes, their own needs. The 1970s divorce generation built themselves from scratch, and somehow they turned childhood fragmentation into adult resilience.